The airport was buzzing with travelers, announcements echoing from every corner. People rushed to their gates, dragging their suitcases behind them, eager to reach their destinations. Among them was a man who barely noticed the crowd around him. He walked with confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his sharp eyes focused straight ahead. This was Ryan Carter, a billionaire CEO known for building an empire from the ground up. Ryan didn't enjoy flying, but it was a necessary part of his life. He had just finished days of intense business meetings and was on his way back home. As he entered the plane, he barely acknowledged the flight attendants who greeted him at the entrance. His mind was still filled with thoughts of contracts, profits, and the next big deal. Meanwhile, Emma Collins, a flight attendant with years of experience, was making sure everything was in order for the long journey ahead. She had seen all kinds of passengers, some polite, some rude, some lost in their own world, just like the man who had just walked past her without a glance. She sighed quietly. To her, passengers like him were nothing new. As the flight took off, Ryan leaned back in his first-class seat, rubbing his temples. He hadn't slept properly in days. The constant stress of his work was something he had accepted long ago. Rest was a luxury he could no longer afford. He closed his eyes, hoping to get some sleep, but his mind refused to shut down. A few rows away, Emma was assisting a nervous elderly woman who was clutching the armrest tightly. "It's just a little turbulence," she said gently, her warm smile instantly calming the passenger. She knelt beside the woman, offering her a reassuring conversation to distract her from her fears. Ryan, watching from his seat, found himself oddly impressed. He had spent years around people who were either afraid of him or wanted something from him. But this woman, this flight attendant, was different. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply doing her job with patience and kindness. It was rare to see someone so genuinely caring in a world that often felt cold and calculated. As the turbulence passed, Emma stood up and glanced toward Ryan's seat. She noticed him watching her, but didn't react. Instead, she continued her work, moving through the aisle with practiced ease. Ryan, on the other hand, found himself feeling something unfamiliar, a quiet curiosity. The flight continued as usual, but something had changed for both of them. For Emma, it was just another shift in her routine. But for Ryan, a man used to controlling every part of his life, it was the first time in a long while that he felt intrigued by something, by someone, who had nothing to do with business. Neither of them knew it yet, but this flight was about to change everything. Ryan sat in his first-class seat, staring out of the small airplane window. The city lights below looked like tiny stars scattered across the darkness. He had been on hundreds of flights, but tonight, something felt different. His mind wasn't occupied with business deals or financial reports. Instead, he kept thinking about the flight attendant. He had seen her calm a nervous passenger with such ease, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. There was something about the way she carried herself, not just polite, but genuinely warm. It was rare to see someone like that in his world, where people were always calculating, always wanting something. Ryan sighed and leaned back, rubbing his temples. He knew he should sleep, but his thoughts wouldn't let him. After a few minutes, he gave up. He unbuckled his seatbelt and quietly made his way to the galley, where the flight attendants usually took their short breaks. Emma was standing there, sipping from a paper cup. She looked up in surprise when she saw him. Most first-class passengers never left their seats unless they needed something. And they never came here just to talk. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked politely, expecting him to request another drink or maybe a special meal. Ryan shook his head. "Just needed to stretch my legs," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "That was impressive, the way you handled that passenger earlier." Emma smiled, a little surprised by the compliment. Oh, the elderly woman. She was just nervous. Happens all the time. Ryan crossed his arms and leaned slightly against the counter. "Still, you have a way of making people feel calm. That's not something everyone can do." Emma looked at him for a moment, trying to figure him out. He didn't seem like the kind of man who gave casual compliments. His eyes were sharp, calculating. But tonight, there was something softer in them. "Thanks," she said simply. "I guess after years of doing this job, you just learn how to read people." Ryan nodded, thinking about that. "Reading people," he repeated. "That's something I do too. But in my world, it's usually about figuring out who's lying and who's not." Emma raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound very fun." Ryan let out a small chuckle. "It's not. But it's necessary." For a moment, there was silence. It wasn't awkward, though. It was the kind of silence that felt comfortable, like neither of them needed to fill the space with useless words. "So," Emma finally said, "what do you do when you're not on flights having deep conversations with flight attendants?" Ryan smirked. "I run a company. A big one." Emma gave him a knowing look. "I figured. You have that look." "What look?" "I never sleep because I'm too busy making important decisions look." Ryan let out a genuine laugh. It had been a long time since someone talked to him like this. Not as a billionaire, not as a powerful businessman, but just as a person. Emma glanced at her watch. "I should get back to work." Ryan nodded. "Yeah, I should probably try to sleep." But as he walked back to his seat, he realized something strange. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work. And that in itself was unexpected. The flight had been smooth for the most part, but suddenly the seatbelt sign lit up with a sharp ding. The captain's voice came through the speakers, calm yet serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board. If there are any doctors or medical professionals on this flight, please alert the crew immediately." Ryan looked up from his seat, his focus shifting instantly. Around him, passengers exchanged worried glances, whispering among themselves. Flight attendants moved quickly, their faces calm but determined. Emma was one of them. A few rows ahead, an elderly man was slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow. His wife sat beside him, panic in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Somebody help him." A doctor from economy class quickly stepped forward, squeezing past the passengers. Emma and her fellow flight attendants worked swiftly, bringing out the emergency medical kit. Ryan watched as she knelt beside the man, speaking to him softly, reassuring his wife while handing the doctor whatever he needed. Minutes passed, but the situation wasn't improving. The doctor turned to the lead flight attendant and whispered something. Emma's face tensed before she picked up the intercom. "We need to make an emergency landing," she announced, her voice steady. "Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened as we prepare for landing." Ryan felt the shift in energy. A businessman like him was used to dealing with high-pressure situations, but this was different. There was no boardroom, no strategy, only real human lives at stake. The plane began its descent, and the tension in the cabin was thick. Some passengers prayed, others sat in silence. Ryan stole a glance at Emma. Despite the chaos, she remained focused, her hand steady as she helped secure the patient for landing. 20 minutes later, the plane touched down at a small airport in a remote city. The moment the doors opened, paramedics rushed inside, taking the elderly man onto a stretcher. His wife held his hand, thanking Emma and the crew over and over. As the medical team disappeared into the night, Emma finally let out a breath. The emergency was over, but now came the next challenge: waiting. The captain made another announcement. "Due to crew rest regulations, we will be grounded for several hours before continuing our journey. Passengers may deplane and wait in the terminal." Ryan stood up, stretching his legs. Around him, people were gathering their belongings, talking about the unexpected turn of events. But his attention was still on Emma. She had just helped save a man's life, yet she didn't act like a hero. To her, it was just another part of the job. Something in Ryan stirred. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to know more about this woman. And now, thanks to the unexpected stop, he had time. Ryan stepped into the small airport terminal, adjusting his suit jacket. It was nothing like the luxurious lounges he was used to. No fancy restaurants, no business-class amenities, just a few rows of chairs, vending machines, and tired passengers waiting for the next announcement. Emma, along with the other flight attendants, was making sure everyone settled in. She moved through the crowd, answering questions, reassuring worried travelers, and helping an elderly woman find a more comfortable seat. She looked just as calm as she had on the plane, even though she had been working for hours. Ryan watched her for a moment before walking over. "Do you ever stop?" he asked. Emma looked up, surprised to see him again. "Not really," she said with a small smile. "Passengers still need help, even on the ground." Ryan nodded. He wasn't used to people like her, people who gave their time so freely without expecting anything in return. It was different from his world, where every deal, every action, had a price. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while," he said, glancing around. "How do you usually spend unexpected layovers like this?" Emma shrugged. "Depends on the airport. Sometimes we rest, sometimes we explore, if we're lucky enough to be in a place worth exploring." Ryan looked at the large windows. Outside, the small town stretched under the night sky, quiet and unfamiliar. It wasn't the kind of place he would normally choose to visit, but something about tonight made him want to do something different. "What if we go for a walk?" he asked. Emma raised an eyebrow. "A walk?" "Yeah," he said, surprising even himself. "We have time. Might as well see what's out there." Emma hesitated. She wasn't sure why, but the idea of spending time with him outside the plane felt different. But there was something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even a bit of exhaustion. She could tell he wasn't just asking for the sake of it. After a moment, she smiled. "All right, but if we get lost, it's your fault." Ryan smirked. "Deal." They stepped outside, greeted by a cool breeze. The streets were quiet, with only a few shops still open. They walked side by side, the usual barriers between them feeling a little less solid. Emma led him to a small food stall where a man was grilling skewers over an open flame. The scent of spices filled the air. "Ever tried street food?" she asked. Ryan hesitated. "Not really." Emma laughed. "Figures. All right, billionaire, let's change that." She ordered 2 skewers and handed him one. Ryan took a cautious bite, and to his surprise, it was good. Simple, but good. As they walked through the town, eating and talking, Ryan felt something unusual. Peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work, deals, or responsibilities. He was just present. And that, he realized, was something money could never buy. Ryan and Emma walked slowly through the quiet streets of the small town, the cool night air brushing against their faces. The streetlights cast a soft glow, and the world felt peaceful, far from the busy cities and crowded airports they were used to. For the first time in a long time, Ryan wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't planning his next business move or worrying about numbers. Instead, he was just there, walking, talking, existing in a moment that didn't have to mean anything, but somehow it did. Emma glanced at him. "So, tell me something," she said. "Do you ever take breaks, or is your life just work, work and more work?" Ryan chuckled softly. "Breaks? Haven't heard of those." She smiled but didn't look surprised. "That's what I thought." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that I don't want to. It's just, when you build something from nothing, you don't get the luxury of slowing down. There's always something that needs to be done, always someone waiting for a decision." Emma nodded. "I get that. But don't you ever feel like you're running so fast that you might not even know where you're going anymore?" Ryan stopped walking for a moment. The question caught him off guard. He had spent years moving forward without stopping to think about why. Success had always been his goal, but lately he had started wondering if it was enough. Emma noticed his silence and gave him a small smile. Sorry, that was too deep for a late-night walk, wasn't it? Ryan shook his head. No, it's a good question. And honestly, I don't know the answer. They continued walking until they reached a small bridge overlooking a river. The water shimmered under the moonlight, reflecting the stars above. Emma leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath. This is nice, she said. Quiet. Simple. Ryan stood beside her. Yeah, it is. Emma looked at him. You know, I used to have big dreams too. When I was younger, I wanted to travel, see the world. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. I had responsibilities, so I chose this job. And I don't regret it. But sometimes I wonder, what if? Ryan turned to her. What if what? What if I had taken a different path? What if I had chased something bigger? She sighed, shaking her head. But I guess wondering doesn't change anything. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, maybe. Or maybe it just means it's not too late. Emma gave him a curious look. Not too late for what? He shrugged. For something different. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither of them had anything to say. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something they both felt but weren't ready to name. The night was ending. Soon, they would go back to their separate lives. But something had changed, and neither of them could ignore it. The quiet night felt almost timeless as Ryan and Emma stood on the bridge, looking at the shimmering water below. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. No deadlines, no schedules, no responsibilities. Just two people from completely different lives, sharing a rare moment of peace. Emma finally glanced at her watch and sighed. We should head back. The flight will be resuming soon. Ryan nodded, though he wasn't in a hurry. They started walking back toward the airport, the streets even quieter than before. So, Emma said, breaking the silence, when you're not running your billion-dollar company, what do you actually like to do? What makes Ryan Carter happy? Ryan smirked. You ask a lot of deep questions. She laughed. You avoid a lot of deep answers. He sighed, thinking for a moment. Honestly, I don't know anymore. I used to love building things, starting with an idea and turning it into something real. That used to make me happy. But now, it feels more like a responsibility than a passion. Emma listened carefully. So when was the last time you did something just because you wanted to? Not for work, not for success, just for you. Ryan frowned slightly. He had no answer. His life had been a constant race, always focused on the next goal. He had spent years working so hard that he had forgotten how to simply live. Emma saw the change in his expression and smiled gently. Maybe it's time you figure that out. Ryan looked at her. There was something refreshing about her honesty. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't intimidated by him. She was just being herself. And that was something rare in his world. As they reached the airport, an announcement came over the speakers. Attention, passengers of Flight 702. Your flight will be boarding shortly. Please proceed to the gate. The brief escape was over. Reality was calling them back. Emma turned to Ryan and smiled. Well, it looks like this is it. Back to the skies. Ryan hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply nodded. Yeah, back to reality. They walked toward the boarding gate, surrounded by tired passengers who were eager to continue their journey. But for Ryan, something had shifted. He wasn't just another businessman on another flight. For the first time in a long time, he felt different. Emma returned to her duties as a flight attendant, moving through the aisles, making sure everyone was settled. Ryan watched her for a moment before taking his seat. As the plane took off, he stared out of the window, lost in thought. He had spent years building an empire, but tonight, he had learned something unexpected. Sometimes, the smallest moments could have the biggest impact. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story. The flight continued smoothly through the night sky, but Ryan's mind was anything but calm. He sat in his first-class seat, staring at the clouds outside. Yet all he could think about was the conversation he had with Emma. Her words kept replaying in his mind. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to? It was such a simple question, yet he had no answer. The truth was, his entire life had been about work, about winning, about proving himself. He had built a billion-dollar company, but somewhere along the way, he had lost the ability to enjoy the little things. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Emma was assisting passengers. She moved with ease, smiling warmly, making people feel comfortable. It was clear that she loved what she did, even if it wasn't glamorous. Ryan couldn't remember the last time he had felt that kind of peace. As the flight continued, Emma eventually passed by his seat, checking on passengers. When she reached him, she gave a polite smile. "Everything all right, Mr. Carter?" Ryan smirked. "Back to formalities, huh?" Emma chuckled softly. "Well, we're back in the air. Gotta keep things professional." He nodded, but he wasn't ready to let the conversation end. "You asked me something earlier," he said, "about when I last did something just because I wanted to." Emma raised an eyebrow. "And?" Ryan leaned back slightly. "I think I want to change that." Emma tilted her head, curious. "What does that mean?" He exhaled, as if he was figuring it out as he spoke. "It means I've spent my whole life chasing success, but maybe it's time I start chasing something different." Emma looked at him for a moment, trying to read his expression. He wasn't just saying words, he meant them. Before she could respond, the intercom came on, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." The moment was interrupted, and Emma had to return to her duties. Ryan sighed, fastening his seatbelt as the plane began its slow descent. As they landed and taxied to the gate, passengers gathered their belongings, eager to get off the plane. Ryan stood up, grabbing his briefcase, but for the first time, he wasn't in a rush. Emma was by the exit, saying goodbye to passengers as they disembarked. When Ryan reached her, he hesitated for just a second before speaking. "I don't know what's next," he admitted, "but I do know that this flight was different." Emma smiled softly. "Sometimes, life surprises us." Ryan gave her one last look before stepping off the plane. As he walked through the airport, something felt different inside him. He wasn't just leaving another flight. He was stepping into something new. Ryan walked through the busy airport terminal, his mind still replaying the last few hours. The flight had ended, passengers had gone their separate ways, but something about this trip felt different. For years, his life had been predictable. Meetings, business deals, and a schedule packed with endless responsibilities. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he had slowed down, and all it took was a conversation with someone who saw the world differently. Emma. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to do something. But what? She was a flight attendant. He was a billionaire CEO. Their worlds couldn't be more different. And yet, she had made him question everything. He reached the car service area, where his driver was already waiting. "Mr. Carter," the driver greeted, opening the door. Ryan paused. Normally, he would get in, head to his next destination without thinking twice. But tonight, something made him hesitate. Without another word, he turned around and walked back toward the airport. Inside, Emma was finishing her final checks before heading to the crew lounge. She was exhausted, but it had been a good flight. She had done her job, helped where she could. And now it was time to rest before her next journey. She was about to leave when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Emma." She turned around, surprised. Ryan stood there, slightly out of breath, as if he had just made a last-minute decision to turn back. "You're still here?" she asked, confused. He nodded. "Yeah, I was about to leave, but then I realized something." Emma folded her arms, waiting. "And what's that?" Ryan took a deep breath. I don't want this to be the last time we talk. Emma blinked. Of all the things she expected, this wasn't one of them. Ryan, she started, unsure of what to say. I know we live different lives, he continued. I know this might not make sense, but tonight made me realize that I don't want to just keep running through life without actually living it. He paused. And I think you're someone who knows how to do that. Emma smiled softly. Are you saying you want me to teach you how to live? Ryan chuckled. Maybe. Then, more seriously, he added, I don't know what this is, Emma. But I do know that meeting you changed something for me. Emma looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't just saying empty words. This was real. After a moment, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small notepad, and scribbled something on it. She tore the page and handed it to him. My schedule is unpredictable, she said. But if you really mean what you're saying, call me. Ryan took the paper, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. He smiled. I will. As he walked away, Emma watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she had a feeling this was just the beginning. And for the first time in years, Ryan Carter wasn't thinking about the next deal. He was thinking about what came next for him. For real.